My name is Dante Caravaggio, and I'm a clockmaker from Denver, Colorado. When Yellowstone erupted on July 23, 2024, every digital clock died instantly, but my grandfather's mechanical timepieces kept ticking. For 30 days, I used those ancient clocks to predict deadly blizzards, ration our last food, and keep 7 strangers alive in sub-zero temperatures while the world froze around us. This is how we survived the first month of the Ice Age apocalypse. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. July 23, 2024, 6:43 a.m. Mountain Time. I can tell you the exact second because that's when every digital clock in my Denver shop went haywire. But my grandfather's 1923 Hermel remained perfectly steady. I should have realized then that the old ways would be our salvation. I was hunched over my workbench that morning, adjusting the delicate escapement mechanism of a 1950s Omega pocket watch. The work required absolute concentration, tweezers steady as a surgeon's hands, magnifying glass positioned just right. Tempus Mechanica had been my sanctuary for 18 years, filled with the gentle symphony of ticking timepieces that most people found maddening but I found comforting. Every gear, every spring, every tiny component had its purpose, its rhythm, its place in the grand mechanical dance of time itself. The emergency broadcast alert pierced through the morning calm like a fire alarm. My hand jerked, nearly damaging the watch's delicate balance wheel. I set down my tools with the practiced precision that had become second nature and reached for the small radio I kept on my workbench. The voice was shaking, unprofessional, breaking protocol in ways that made my stomach clench. Yellowstone's supervolcano had erupted. The words seemed impossible, like something from a disaster movie rather than reality. I glanced around my shop, at the dozens of clocks marking their steady progression through what I thought was just another ordinary Wednesday morning. The digital displays on my modern equipment were flickering erratically, numbers scrambling like they were having seizures. My computer monitor went dark, then bright, then displayed random characters before dying completely. But the mechanical clocks kept their perfect time. The grandfather clock my great-grandfather had brought from Switzerland in 1908 continued its steady pendulum swing. The collection of antique mantel clocks maintained their synchronized chorus. Even the temperamental cuckoo clock that had been acting strangely for weeks kept marking the hours with Germanic precision. Something was wrong with that observation, though I couldn't place it immediately. The electromagnetic pulse from the eruption was scrambling electronics across the region, maybe across the entire country. I had read about such possibilities in scientific journals, theoretical discussions about how massive geological events could generate electromagnetic field strong enough to cripple modern infrastructure. What I hadn't expected was how beautiful the mechanical world would look when the digital one died. I walked to the front window of my shop and peered out at the street. Cars were pulling over, drivers staring at dead dashboard displays. People stood on sidewalks holding useless phones, pressing buttons that no longer responded. A woman across the street was crying, shaking her device like that would somehow resurrect it. The traffic lights had gone dark, creating confusion at the intersection where Pearl Street met 15th. Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment building next door was standing in her doorway, looking lost. She was 72, lived alone since her husband died 3 years ago, and had always been kind to me when I helped carry her groceries. I had fixed her old kitchen clock twice, refusing payment both times because she reminded me of my grandmother. Now she was staring at the sky with an expression I had never seen before, something between confusion and terror. I stepped outside, my practiced eye automatically noting the barometric pressure gauge mounted near my shop's entrance. The needle was spinning wildly, swinging between readings that made no meteorological sense. My grandfather had installed that instrument in 1957, claiming it could predict weather changes days in advance. He had been right more often than wrong, though I had always attributed his accuracy to experience rather than the antique device. The gauge was showing pressure drops that indicated an approaching storm system of unprecedented magnitude. Not the usual Colorado thunderstorm or winter blizzard, but something far more dramatic. The readings were so extreme I wondered if the electromagnetic pulse had damaged the mechanism, except mechanical barometers don't rely on electronics. They respond to actual atmospheric pressure through springs and levers, the same reliable technology that had predicted weather for centuries before satellites and computer models. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed me and hurried over, her face pale with worry. She spoke rapidly in a mixture of English and Spanish, telling me her television was dead, her phone wouldn't turn on, even her digital alarm clock had stopped working. I listened while scanning the sky, noting how clear and blue it appeared despite the barometric instrument's warnings. Colorado weather could change quickly, but this felt different. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. I invited her into my shop, partly from kindness and partly because I needed someone else to confirm what I was seeing. The mechanical clocks were all functioning normally, their various ticks and chimes creating the familiar rhythm that had been the soundtrack of my adult life. But when I looked more closely, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The antique cuckoo clock, the one that had belonged to my grandfather's father, was calling hours that didn't exist. It had chimed 13 times at what should have been noon. 13 o'clock didn't exist, yet the bird had emerged from its tiny wooden house and announced the impossible hour with mechanical certainty. I had serviced that clock hundreds of times over the years, knew every gear and spring in its movement. There was no way for it to chime 13 times unless something fundamental had changed in the world around it. Mrs. Rodriguez was examining my grandfather clock, running her fingers along its wooden case with obvious admiration. She told me it reminded her of one her father had owned in Mexico before the revolution forced her family north. I found myself sharing stories I rarely told customers, about learning the trade from my grandfather, about the Swiss clockmaker who had taught him the old techniques, about the philosophy that saw time not as numbers on a screen, but as a physical force that could be captured and controlled through precision engineering. As we talked, more people began gathering outside. The initial confusion was giving way to panic as the reality of the situation became clear. This wasn't a temporary power outage or a simple equipment failure. Every piece of modern technology in Denver, possibly in the entire region, had been rendered useless by whatever electromagnetic effects the Yellowstone eruption had unleashed. Cars wouldn't start, phones were dead, even battery-powered devices had been fried by the pulse. I found myself becoming an informal information center, not because I knew more about the eruption than anyone else, but because my shop was one of the few places where time was still being accurately measured. People wanted to know what time it was, when their phones might start working again, how long they should wait before trying to drive home. I gave them the time from my mechanical clocks and tried to explain that electronic recovery might take days or weeks, not hours. The afternoon brought new concerns. Radio stations that had survived the pulse were broadcasting increasingly dire reports about the eruption's magnitude. The ash cloud was massive, larger than any volcanic event in recorded history. Atmospheric scientists were using words like catastrophic and unprecedented. Climate researchers were making comparisons to historical volcanic winters, periods when massive eruptions had blocked sunlight for months or even years. I remembered reading about the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, how it had caused global temperature drops and crop failures. That event had been called the year without a summer, creating famine and climate chaos across the northern hemisphere. But Yellowstone was orders of magnitude larger, a supervolcano with the power to affect global climate for decades. The barometric pressure gauge continued its erratic behavior, and I began taking readings every hour, recording them in a leather-bound notebook I used for client records. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood how to read atmospheric pressure. A massive weather system was approaching, something far more severe than normal storm activity. The pressure drops suggested wind speeds and temperature changes that seemed impossible for late July in Colorado. By evening, the first signs of ash began appearing in the western sky. It looked like a distant thunderstorm at first, a dark line on the horizon that might bring rain and relief from the summer heat. But as it grew closer, the color was wrong. Instead of the blue-black of normal storm clouds, this was a brownish-gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ash cloud from Yellowstone was reaching Colorado. Mrs. Rodriguez had stayed in my shop most of the day, helping me explain time to confused customers and sharing her own stories about living through difficult periods. She had survived the Mexico City earthquake of 1985, lived through economic collapses and political upheavals that had taught her the value of preparation and community. As the ash cloud approached, she made a decision that would save her life. She asked if she could stay in my shop overnight, just until her building's power came back and things returned to normal. I agreed, though something in my gut told me that normal was a concept we might need to abandon. The mechanical clocks continued their steady progression through time, but the world outside was changing in ways that felt permanent rather than temporary. I prepared a sleeping area in the back room of my shop, sharing my small supply of emergency food and water, while trying to ignore the growing certainty that emergency was becoming our new reality. The temperature began dropping as soon as the ash cloud blocked the sun. It wasn't gradual cooling like a normal summer evening, but a sharp, immediate decrease that had Mrs. Rodriguez pulling on sweaters she had borrowed from my emergency supplies. I monitored the barometric gauge obsessively, watching pressure readings that continued defying everything I thought I knew about Colorado weather patterns. The ash began falling around 10 o'clock that night, tiny gray particles that looked almost like snow in the streetlights that still functioned. Within an hour, it was covering everything with a fine layer of volcanic dust that tasted metallic and made breathing difficult. I sealed the windows and doors of my shop as best I could, using techniques my grandfather had taught me for weatherproofing against Colorado's harsh winters. By midnight, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By 2 in the morning, it was down 25 degrees from the afternoon high. This wasn't normal weather variation. This was the beginning of something unprecedented. The ash was blocking sunlight and trapping cold air, creating conditions that reminded me of nuclear winter scenarios I had read about in Cold War survival manuals. Mrs. Rodriguez was having trouble sleeping, not just from the uncomfortable makeshift bed, but from the sound of the mechanical clocks. What I found soothing, she found ominous. She told me the constant ticking reminded her of time running out, of countdowns to disasters she couldn't prevent. I tried to explain that the clocks represented reliability and continuity, that as long as they kept ticking, we had a way to measure and manage whatever was coming. The cuckoo clock chimed 13 times at what should have been 3 in the morning. Mrs. Rodriguez heard it too, confirming that I wasn't imagining the impossible hour. She crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish, telling me that her grandmother had owned a clock that did similar things before earthquakes. According to family legend, some timepieces were sensitive to disturbances in the natural order, mechanical devices that could detect changes humans couldn't perceive. I spent the remaining hours before dawn checking and winding every clock in my shop, a ritual that usually brought me comfort, but now felt like preparation for siege. Each timepiece represented decades or centuries of reliable service, mechanisms that had survived wars and disasters, and continued measuring time regardless of human chaos. If the modern world was collapsing around us, these mechanical marvels would be our anchor to civilization. As dawn approached, the ash fall intensified. What had started as light dustings was becoming heavy precipitation that accumulated like snow. The temperature continued dropping, reaching levels that were unthinkable for late July in Denver. Mrs. Rodriguez and I took turns monitoring the barometric gauge, which was now showing pressure readings that suggested weather phenomena beyond anything in the historical record. The first neighbors began arriving at my shop around 6 in the morning. Word had spread that the clockmaker had working timepieces and seemed to understand what was happening. The Henderson family from 3 blocks away brought their 2 children, 8-year-old Tommy and 12-year-old Sarah, both fascinated by the mechanical clocks despite their parents' obvious anxiety. Mr. Henderson was a software engineer whose entire world had vanished with the electromagnetic pulse. His expertise in digital systems was suddenly worthless, while my knowledge of mechanical engineering had become invaluable. He kept asking when the power would be restored, when cell towers would start functioning again, when life would return to normal. I had to tell him that based on the barometric readings and the ash fall intensity, we might be looking at weeks or months of disruption, not days. The children were less concerned with the larger implications and more interested in how the clocks worked. Tommy was amazed that timepieces could function without electricity, while Sarah wanted to understand the mathematical relationships between gears and springs. I found myself teaching basic clockwork principles, while their parents discussed increasingly desperate plans for getting home or finding relatives in other states. By 9 in the morning, the ash accumulation was 3 inches deep and still falling. The temperature had stabilized at levels more appropriate for late October than late July. The combination of blocked sunlight and volcanic ash was creating an artificial winter that showed no signs of ending. My barometric readings suggested this was just the beginning of a weather pattern that could persist for months. Mrs. Rodriguez made coffee on the small gas camping stove I kept for emergencies, sharing the warmth and caffeine with our growing group of refugees. The Henderson children helped me wind clocks and learn to read the various timepieces, turning my shop into an impromptu classroom where mechanical knowledge was suddenly more valuable than computer skills. The radio reports were becoming increasingly grim. The ash cloud was continental in scope, affecting weather patterns from Canada to Mexico. Transportation systems were failing as airports closed and highways became impassable. Supply chains that depended on just-in-time delivery were breaking down, as trucks and trains couldn't navigate the ash-covered roads and rails. I realized that the 13 chimes from the cuckoo clock weren't a malfunction but a warning. The timepiece was responding to atmospheric conditions that were literally unprecedented in its century of existence. The mechanical movement was detecting pressure and electromagnetic changes that fell outside normal parameters, causing it to announce impossible hours because impossible times were exactly what we were facing. The grandfather clock's pendulum was starting to swing with minute irregularities, tiny variations in its arc that most people wouldn't notice, but that I could detect after years of careful observation. The clock had maintained perfect time for over a century, but something in the environment was affecting even its massive, stable movement. Whatever was happening to our world was profound enough to disturb mechanical systems that had weathered every crisis of the past 100 years. As the morning progressed, more neighbors arrived seeking shelter and information. My small shop was becoming a community center, a place where people gathered not just for physical warmth, but for the psychological comfort of knowing that time was still being measured accurately. In a world where digital displays had gone dark and electronic devices had failed, the steady ticking of mechanical timepieces represented continuity and hope. The Henderson family was growing increasingly anxious about staying away from their house. Mr. Henderson wanted to drive south to New Mexico where his parents lived, convinced that getting away from the ash cloud would solve their problems. I showed him the barometric readings, explained that the pressure patterns suggested weather disturbances extending far beyond Colorado's borders. But modern people were accustomed to mobility, to the idea that problems could be solved by simply driving away from them. Mrs. Rodriguez supported my position, sharing stories from her youth about volcanic eruptions in Mexico and the importance of staying in place until conditions stabilized. She had lived through natural disasters before and understood that movement during crisis often led to worse danger than staying put. But the Hendersons were frightened and desperate, their faith in technology shaken by the complete failure of everything they depended on. The ash continued falling throughout the day, accumulating to 6 inches by noon and showing no signs of stopping. The temperature remained at unseasonably cold levels, creating conditions that made outdoor activity dangerous without proper preparation. I began rationing my emergency food supplies, calculating how long our resources might last if the crisis extended beyond a few days. The children were adapting better than the adults, finding wonder in the mechanical clocks and asking sophisticated questions about gear ratios and spring tension. Tommy discovered that he could predict which clock would chime next by listening to the subtle differences in their ticking patterns. Sarah became fascinated with the barometric gauge, learning to read atmospheric pressure and understanding how it related to weather changes. As evening approached, the Hendersons made their fateful decision. Despite my warnings about the barometric readings and the worsening road conditions, they decided to attempt the drive to New Mexico. Mr. Henderson was convinced that his four-wheel drive vehicle could handle the ash-covered roads, that moving south would get them ahead of the weather system. I gave them my most accurate mechanical watch and showed Mr. Henderson how to wind it properly. I explained the importance of maintaining precise timekeeping for navigation and survival, trying to provide them with tools that might keep them alive if my worst fears proved correct. Mrs. Rodriguez blessed them in Spanish and made them promise to turn back if conditions became too dangerous. They left just as the sun was setting, though the thick ash cloud made it impossible to see any trace of sunset. The world outside my shop had taken on a perpetual twilight quality, gray and dim, and cold in ways that felt fundamentally wrong for summer in Colorado. The barometric gauge was showing pressure readings that suggested another major weather system was approaching, something that would make the current conditions seem mild by comparison. Mrs. Rodriguez and I watched from the window as the Henderson family's headlights disappeared into the ash-laden darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady ticking of the mechanical clocks, measuring out seconds and minutes of time that felt increasingly precious. I wound the grandfather clock one final time before bed, listening to its familiar chimes marking 10 o'clock in a world where time itself was becoming our most valuable possession. The cuckoo clock remained quiet as we prepared for our second night in the shop, but I could feel something building in the atmosphere around us, pressure changes and electromagnetic disturbances that my grandfather's instruments were detecting even if my conscious mind couldn't fully process them. The mechanical timepieces continued their steady measurement of time, anchoring us to civilization while everything else crumbled around us. What I decided next would determine not just my survival, but the survival of everyone who would come to depend on the steady tick of mechanical time in a world where digital convenience had become digital vulnerability. The clocks kept ticking, measuring moments in a crisis that was just beginning to reveal its true magnitude. The seventh day began with a sound I had never heard before in 18 years of clockmaking. Mrs. Rodriguez was coughing in a way that made my chest tighten with worry, the kind of wet, rattling cough that suggested her lungs were struggling with the volcanic ash that had been seeping through every crack and crevice of my shop. I found her huddled near the small gas heater we had been using sparingly to conserve fuel, wrapped in every blanket I owned but still shivering from cold that seemed to penetrate straight to the bone. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees overnight, reaching levels that would have been remarkable for December, let alone late July. My breath was visible in the gray morning light that filtered through ash-covered windows, and frost had formed on the inside of the glass despite our efforts to seal the shop. The barometric pressure gauge was showing readings so low they fell outside the instrument's normal range, suggesting atmospheric conditions that had no precedent in meteorological history. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to smile when she saw me checking the mechanical clocks, but her face was pale and drawn in ways that made me realize how quickly this crisis was aging all of us. She had been strong and resilient during our first days together, sharing stories and hope while the world changed around us. Now she looked fragile, vulnerable in ways that reminded me how dependent we had all become on systems that were no longer functioning. I helped her to the bathroom, supporting her weight as she shuffled across the shop floor. The pipes were still functioning, though I could hear concerning sounds in the walls that suggested freezing was beginning to affect the building's plumbing. My grandfather had taught me to recognize the subtle signs of thermal stress in building systems, the way metal and wood respond to temperature changes that exceed their normal tolerance. When Mrs. Rodriguez was settled with warm tea made on the camping stove, I took detailed readings from all my weather instruments. The barometric pressure had continued falling throughout the night, creating conditions that typically preceded severe storm systems. But these readings were beyond severe. They suggested atmospheric disturbances that could generate weather phenomena unlike anything in recorded history. The mechanical clocks continued their steady progression through time, though I was noticing subtle variations in their movements that concerned me deeply. The grandfather clock's pendulum was swinging with microscopic irregularities, variations so small that only someone with my training would detect them. The antique mantle clocks were running slightly fast, gaining perhaps 30 seconds over 12 hours. Even the reliable Swiss movements were showing signs of stress from the extreme environmental conditions. Around 8 in the morning, we heard voices outside the shop. I peered through the ash-covered window and saw 3 figures struggling through what was now nearly a foot of accumulated volcanic dust. They were moving slowly, obviously exhausted, carrying bundles that suggested they were refugees from somewhere else in the city. I recognized one of them as James Chen, who ran the electronics repair shop 2 blocks away, though he looked dramatically different than the last time I had seen him. I opened the door carefully, trying to prevent too much ash from entering the shop while allowing the 3 survivors inside. James was accompanied by an elderly man I didn't recognize and a woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez. She was a resident at Denver General Hospital, though she explained that the hospital had been evacuated when its backup generators failed and electronic medical equipment became useless. Dr. Martinez immediately went to Mrs. Rodriguez, examining her with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize serious medical conditions. Her diagnosis was concerning but not surprising. The volcanic ash was affecting everyone's respiratory system, but Mrs. Rodriguez's age made her particularly vulnerable to the fine particles that were infiltrating every building in the city. Without proper filtration or medical equipment, her condition would likely worsen. James Chen's story was harrowing in ways that made me realize how fortunate Mrs. Rodriguez and I had been to stay in my shop. He had tried to walk home to his apartment across town when his car wouldn't start, but the ash fall had made navigation nearly impossible. Street signs were obscured, familiar landmarks were buried, and the constant gray twilight made it difficult to maintain direction. He had become lost in his own neighborhood, wandering for hours before finding shelter in an abandoned store. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Robert Walsh, had been living alone in a senior housing complex when the power failed permanently. At 78, he had survived the Cold War, Vietnam, and multiple economic collapses, but nothing had prepared him for the complete breakdown of technological infrastructure. He had walked 6 miles through ash-covered streets to reach the downtown area, following rumors that someone near Pearl Street had working clocks and reliable information about what was happening. Dr. Martinez brought medical knowledge that helped me understand the physiological challenges we were facing. The volcanic ash contained silica particles that could cause permanent lung damage if inhaled over extended periods. The temperature drop was creating hypothermia risks that were complicated by the body's increased energy needs for heating and breathing. Most concerning, the blocked sunlight was already beginning to affect vitamin D production and psychological well-being in ways that would worsen over time. I shared my food and water supplies with the new arrivals, calculating consumption rates against remaining inventory in ways that made the mathematics of survival starkly clear. We now had 5 adults depending on resources I had originally planned for one person during a temporary emergency. The camping stove fuel would last perhaps 2 more weeks if we were extremely careful. The canned food might stretch for 10 days with strict rationing. James Chen proved invaluable in helping me understand what was happening to the broader infrastructure. As an electronics repair specialist, he knew how electromagnetic pulses affected different types of equipment. The initial burst from the Yellowstone eruption had permanently damaged most solid-state electronics within a radius of hundreds of miles. Even devices that seemed undamaged were failing as their circuits degraded from radiation exposure and environmental stress. But more importantly, James understood the cascading effects of technological failure on modern society. The power grid wasn't just down, it was destroyed. The complex computer systems that managed electricity distribution, water treatment, food delivery, and communication networks were all permanently offline. Even if the ash cloud cleared tomorrow, it would take months or years to rebuild the infrastructure that modern life depended upon. Dr. Martinez provided equally sobering analysis from a medical perspective. Denver General Hospital had evacuated patients to facilities outside the affected area, but the transportation challenges meant that many people with chronic conditions were now without access to medications or treatments. The elderly, the very young, and anyone with respiratory problems were particularly vulnerable to conditions that would have been easily treatable just a week ago. Robert Walsh contributed wisdom that came from having lived through multiple historical crises. He remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis, when people had prepared for nuclear war by stockpiling supplies and learning survival skills. He had lived through the oil crises of the 1970s, when energy shortages forced communities to find alternative ways of heating and transportation. But he emphasized that those events had been temporary disruptions to functioning systems, while our current situation represented the complete collapse of technological civilization. As we shared stories and assessed our situation, I found myself becoming the de facto leader of our small group. Not because I was the oldest or most experienced, but because I possessed the only reliable way of measuring time and predicting weather changes. The mechanical clocks and barometric instruments that had been my professional tools were now essential survival equipment for our entire community. I established schedules based on precise timekeeping, rationing food and fuel according to mechanical measurements rather than guesswork. Dr. Martinez helped me calculate caloric needs and water requirements, while James Chen contributed technical knowledge about conserving energy and maintaining our limited equipment. Robert Walsh shared practical wisdom about staying warm and healthy during extended emergencies. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her respiratory distress, became our morale officer and cultural memory keeper. She told stories from her childhood in Mexico, shared recipes that could be adapted to our limited ingredients, and provided the kind of emotional stability that kept panic at bay. Her presence reminded us that humans had survived difficult conditions before, that community and cooperation were more valuable than individual resources. The 8th day brought new challenges that tested our growing sense of organization. The ashfall had intensified overnight, accumulating to nearly 18 inches and continuing to fall at rates that made outdoor movement extremely dangerous. The weight of ash on the shop's roof was creating structural stress that I could hear in the building's framework, subtle creaking and settling sounds that suggested we might need to evacuate if accumulation continued at current rates. More concerning was the sound coming from the building's plumbing. The pipes were making noises I had never heard before, groaning and popping sounds that indicated thermal stress beyond their design limits. I knew from my grandfather's teachings about building maintenance that frozen pipes could burst with explosive force, flooding our shelter and potentially forcing us into the lethal conditions outside. Dr. Martinez helped me triage our medical supplies and identify potential health risks before they became critical. Mrs. Rodriguez's respiratory condition was stabilizing with warm steam treatments and careful activity management, but we all needed to be vigilant about ash exposure and hypothermia. James Chen proved resourceful in creating improvised filtration systems using materials from my shop, while Robert Walsh contributed knowledge about nutrition and hygiene during extended emergencies. On the ninth day, we faced our first major technical crisis when the camping stove began malfunctioning. The extreme cold was affecting the fuel canisters and ignition system in ways that threatened our primary heat source. I applied clockwork precision to diagnosing the problem, using mechanical troubleshooting techniques to identify issues that electronic diagnostics couldn't address. James Chen and I worked together to repair the stove, combining his understanding of fuel systems with my mechanical expertise. The solution required cannibalizing parts from other equipment and creating improvised components using tools from my clockmaking workshop. The repair took 6 hours of careful work, during which our shelter's temperature dropped to levels that made concentration difficult and fine motor control challenging. Dr. Martinez monitored everyone's condition during the repair work, watching for signs of hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning from our improvised heating sources. She established medical protocols based on mechanical timing, using my clocks to schedule vital sign checks and medication administration for Mrs. Rodriguez's respiratory treatments. Robert Walsh proved invaluable during the crisis, sharing knowledge about emergency heating and ventilation that he had learned during his military service in Korea. He helped us create backup heating systems using materials from my shop, improvised solutions that didn't require electricity or complex fuel systems. The 10th day marked a turning point in our group dynamics when Mrs. Rodriguez made a suggestion that probably saved all our lives. She proposed that we establish a formal rationing system based on the mechanical clocks, using precise timekeeping to ensure fair distribution of food, water, and heating fuel. Her idea transformed our informal cooperation into systematic resource management. I created detailed schedules using clockwork precision, calculating consumption rates, and establishing distribution times that maximized our supplies while maintaining everyone's health. Dr. Martinez provided medical input about nutritional needs and caloric requirements, while James Chen contributed technical expertise about fuel efficiency and equipment maintenance. The rationing system worked because it was based on mechanical reliability rather than human judgment. The clocks didn't play favorites or make emotional decisions. They simply measured time with mathematical precision that everyone could trust. When the grandfather clock chimed meal times, we ate. When the mantle clock indicated fuel allocation periods, we used heat. The mechanical timepieces became our government, our law, our social contract. But the 11th day brought a discovery that filled me with dread about what might be coming. The cuckoo clock chimed 13 times at what should have been 9 in the morning, and again at what should have been 3 in the afternoon. The impossible hours were becoming more frequent, suggesting that whatever atmospheric disturbances the antique timepiece was detecting were intensifying rather than stabilizing. James Chen asked me to explain the 13 chimes, and I shared my grandfather's stories about the clock's history. According to family legend, the timepiece had been made by a clockmaker in the Black Forest who claimed his creations could detect supernatural events. My grandfather had dismissed such stories as folklore, but he had also noted that the clock's unusual behavior always preceded major weather changes. Dr. Martinez, who had scientific training, was skeptical of supernatural explanations, but interested in the possibility that the clock was responding to electromagnetic or atmospheric phenomena that our modern instruments couldn't measure. She pointed out that many animals exhibited unusual behavior before earthquakes or severe weather, suggesting that mechanical devices might also be sensitive to environmental changes that humans couldn't consciously detect. Robert Walsh surprised us all by taking the 13 chimes seriously. He had lived through enough historical events to respect patterns that couldn't be easily explained by conventional science. In his experience, unusual phenomena often preceded major changes, and ignoring such warnings could be fatal during crisis situations. The 12th day forced us to confront the reality that our situation was not temporary. The ash was still falling, the temperature continued dropping, and radio reports suggested that conditions were worsening across the entire continental United States. This was not a short-term emergency that would resolve itself in days or weeks, but a fundamental change in the world's climate systems. I began teaching everyone in our group how to read the mechanical clocks and weather instruments, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of my family. Dr. Martinez proved an excellent student, quickly grasping the mathematical relationships between barometric pressure and weather patterns. James Chen adapted his technical troubleshooting skills to mechanical systems, learning to detect problems in clockwork through sound and vibration analysis. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her health challenges, insisted on learning the basics of clock maintenance and timekeeping. She understood that knowledge needed to be distributed among our group in case something happened to me. Robert Walsh contributed his own expertise, teaching us military techniques for equipment maintenance and resource conservation that complemented my mechanical knowledge. The 13th day brought visitors who would change everything about our small community. We heard voices outside the shop around 10 in the morning, multiple people calling for the clockmaker. When I opened the door carefully, I found a family of 4 standing in the ash-covered street, obviously exhausted and desperate for shelter. The Miller family had walked 12 miles from the suburbs, following rumors that someone downtown had working clocks and reliable information about the crisis. Tom Miller was a construction foreman whose practical skills would prove invaluable, while his wife Janet was a nurse whose medical knowledge complemented Dr. Martinez's training. Their 2 teenage children, 15-year-old Michael and 13-year-old Lisa, brought youth and energy that our group desperately needed. But accepting the Miller family meant stretching our resources even further. We now had 9 people depending on supplies calculated for 5, creating mathematical challenges that required creative solutions. I gathered everyone for a formal meeting, using the grandfather clock to establish precise discussion periods and decision-making protocols. The meeting revealed the strength of our community and the wisdom of our systematic approach to survival. Instead of panic or arguments about resources, everyone contributed ideas for managing our expanded group. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller combined their medical expertise to create better health protocols. James Chen and Tom Miller pooled their technical knowledge to improve our heating and ventilation systems. Mrs. Rodriguez and the teenage children formed an unexpected partnership, with Michael and Lisa helping her manage food preparation and distribution, while she shared stories and cultural knowledge that kept morale high. Robert Walsh became our military advisor, teaching basic security and resource protection techniques that none of us had previously considered necessary. I found myself coordinating all these efforts through mechanical precision, using clockwork timing to schedule activities, and ensure that everyone's contributions were recognized and utilized effectively. The shop was becoming crowded, but it was also becoming a genuine community where individual skills combined to create collective strength. The 14th day tested our new organization when we discovered that someone had been stealing our food. Small amounts were missing from our carefully rationed supplies, thefts that threatened the mathematical precision of our survival calculations. The discovery created tension and suspicion that could have destroyed our community cooperation. I called a formal meeting using the chimes of the grandfather clock, establishing a discussion protocol that allowed everyone to speak without accusations or confrontations. The systematic approach revealed that the thefts were not malicious, but desperate. Attempts by hungry people to stretch inadequate rations rather than deliberate sabotage of our group's survival. The solution came from Mrs. Rodriguez, who suggested that we establish an emergency food reserve that could be accessed by anyone experiencing severe hunger, with the understanding that such access would be balanced by additional work contributions to the community. The system worked because it was based on mechanical fairness rather than human judgment, with the clocks determining work periods and food access according to mathematical formulas rather than emotional decisions. But the real test of our community came on the 15th day when we heard desperate pounding on the shop door just after midnight. Tom Miller and I opened it carefully to find the Henderson family standing in the ash-covered street, obviously near death from exposure and exhaustion. They had returned from their attempted escape to New Mexico, but barely survived the journey that had nearly killed them all. Mr. Henderson could barely speak through chattering teeth as he told us about their experience. The roads had become impassable within 50 miles of Denver, buried under ash drifts that no vehicle could navigate. They had abandoned their car and walked back through conditions that would have been fatal without the mechanical watch I had given them for navigation and timing. 8-year-old Tommy Henderson was unconscious from hypothermia, while 12-year-old Sarah was delirious from dehydration and exhaustion. Mrs. Henderson was suffering from severe respiratory distress, coughing up blood that indicated serious lung damage from ash inhalation. Mr. Henderson himself was barely functioning, supported only by desperate determination to save his family. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller immediately went to work on the Henderson family, applying every medical technique available without modern equipment. They used warm water heated on our camping stove to gradually raise body temperatures, improvised respiratory treatments using steam and careful positioning, and administered basic first aid with supplies that were critically limited. The medical crisis stretched our resources beyond calculated limits and forced us to make decisions about resource allocation that challenged every system we had established. Saving the Henderson family required using emergency food and fuel reserves, disrupting our carefully planned rationing schedules, and creating uncertainty about our own long-term survival. But it also revealed the true strength of our community and the importance of the mechanical systems that held us together. The clocks continued measuring time with mathematical precision while we worked through the night to save 4 lives. The steady ticking provided psychological stability during hours of uncertainty, reminding us that time itself continued regardless of human crisis. Standing over the Hendersons' frozen car, I realized that predicting time wasn't enough anymore. I had to start controlling it, using mechanical precision to manage not just resources and schedules, but the complex human dynamics of a community under extraordinary stress. The 13 chimes of the cuckoo clock were warning us about something much worse than weather, and we needed to be ready for whatever was coming next. The 13th day began with a discovery that haunts me still. I found the Henderson family's car exactly where Mr. Henderson had said it would be, buried under 3 feet of ash on Interstate 25, about 15 miles south of Denver. Tom Miller and I had ventured out during a brief lull in the ash fall, following the mechanical compass I had calibrated using my grandfather's techniques for navigation when electronic systems failed. The car looked like a tomb covered in gray snow, windows frosted over from the inside where 4 people had slowly frozen to death, despite their desperate attempts to stay warm. I used my pocket knife to scrape away ash from the driver's side window, revealing the scene that would change everything about how our community understood the stakes we were facing. Mr. Henderson was slumped over the steering wheel, still wearing the mechanical watch I had given him for the journey. The timepiece had stopped at 2:17, marking the exact moment when the extreme cold had finally overcome the spring tension that kept it running. Mrs. Henderson was in the passenger seat, wrapped in every piece of clothing the family owned, her arms around 8-year-old Tommy in a final attempt to share body heat. 12-year-old Sarah was in the back seat, curled under blankets that had proven inadequate against the supernatural cold that was gripping Colorado. She was holding a small notebook where she had recorded their final hours, writing in precise handwriting that showed how the mechanical watch had helped them track time even as hope ran out. Her last entry was timed at 1:43 a.m., noting that the car's heater had failed and the windows were beginning to frost over from their breath. Tom Miller stood beside me in the ash-covered wasteland that had once been a busy highway, both of us understanding that we were looking at our own possible future if we made the wrong decisions about survival. The Henderson family had been educated, resourceful people with a reliable vehicle and emergency supplies. They had died because they underestimated the severity of the climate change and overestimated their ability to escape it through mobility. I removed the mechanical watch from Mr. Henderson's wrist, winding it carefully and noting that the mechanism was undamaged despite the extreme conditions. The timepiece represented more than just an instrument for measuring time. It was proof that mechanical reliability could outlast human life in situations where electronic technology was useless. I reset the watch to match my grandfather clock and made a mental note to share this lesson with our community. The journey back to my shop took 3 hours through ash drifts that were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Tom Miller and I used mechanical compass readings and dead reckoning techniques to maintain direction in conditions where visibility was limited to perhaps 10 feet. The landscape had been transformed into an alien environment where familiar landmarks were buried and street signs were illegible under layers of volcanic dust. When we returned to the shop, I gathered our entire community using the chimes of the grandfather clock to signal a formal meeting. We now had 9 people depending on my mechanical knowledge and leadership, and they deserved to understand the full reality of what we were facing. I shared the details of what we had found, including Sarah Henderson's notebook entries that documented how quickly hypothermia could kill even prepared people. Dr. Martinez asked detailed questions about the timeline recorded in Sarah's notebook, using her medical training to understand the physiological progression that had led to the family's death. The notebook revealed that the car's heater had functioned for approximately 6 hours after the engine died, but the extreme cold had overwhelmed even that heat source. The family had survived for nearly 14 hours in the disabled vehicle before succumbing to temperatures that were impossible for late July in Colorado. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself and said a prayer in Spanish for the Henderson family, but she also used their death as a teaching moment for our community. She had lived through multiple disasters in Mexico and understood that survival often depended on learning from the mistakes of others. The Hendersons had died because they chose mobility over security, because they trusted modern technology over proven survival techniques. James Chen, our electronics expert, pointed out that the Henderson family's GPS system had failed within hours of leaving Denver, leaving them without navigation aids in an environment where roads were becoming impassable. Their cell phones had been useless, their digital compass had malfunctioned, and even their electronic emergency radio had been damaged by the electromagnetic effects of the ash cloud. But I had given Mr. Henderson a mechanical watch that had continued functioning until the moment of his death, providing accurate timekeeping that had allowed Sarah to document their final hours with precision. The contrast between electronic failure and mechanical reliability was becoming a central theme of our survival, a lesson that our community needed to understand completely. Tom Miller, whose construction experience included emergency response work, helped me explain the mathematical relationship between temperature, time, and human survival. The Henderson family's death had followed predictable patterns that could be calculated using mechanical precision. Body heat loss in extreme cold, caloric requirements for maintaining core temperature, and the timeline for hypothermia progression were all measurable phenomena that didn't require electronic equipment to monitor. I used the Henderson family's tragedy to establish new protocols for our community survival. Number 1 would be allowed to leave the shop alone or without mechanical navigation equipment. All outdoor activities would be limited to essential tasks and would follow strict timing schedules based on my weather instruments. Most importantly, we would abandon any thoughts of mobility until atmospheric conditions showed clear signs of improvement. The 14th day brought a new crisis that tested our community's resolve and my leadership abilities. Mrs. Rodriguez's respiratory condition was worsening despite Dr. Martinez's best efforts, and we were facing the possibility that our eldest community member might not survive much longer. Her coughing had become more frequent and severe, and she was having difficulty maintaining body temperature even with our carefully managed heating systems. Dr. Martinez explained that Mrs. Rodriguez was suffering from pneumoconiosis, a lung condition caused by prolonged inhalation of fine particles. The volcanic ash contained silica and other minerals that were causing permanent damage to her respiratory system, damage that would be fatal without modern medical equipment and medications. We could manage her symptoms and make her comfortable, but we couldn't cure the underlying condition. The medical crisis forced me to confront the limitations of mechanical precision in managing human health. I could time medication schedules and monitor her condition using clockwork accuracy, but the clocks couldn't heal damaged lungs or provide oxygen therapy. For the first time since the crisis began, my mechanical expertise felt inadequate to protect someone who had become family to our community. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her deteriorating condition, insisted on continuing her contributions to our group survival. She worked with Janet Miller to establish food preparation schedules that maximized nutrition while minimizing fuel consumption. She taught the teenage children, Michael and Lisa Miller, traditional preservation techniques that didn't require refrigeration or electronic equipment. Most importantly, Mrs. Rodriguez helped me understand that leadership during crisis required more than mechanical precision. She shared stories from her experience surviving the Mexico City earthquake, explaining how communities succeeded or failed based on their ability to maintain hope and cooperation under extreme stress. The steady ticking of clocks provided structure, but human connections provided the motivation to keep going. I found myself spending more time talking with Mrs. Rodriguez during her rest periods, learning about community management from someone who had survived multiple disasters. She taught me that successful leadership required balancing individual needs with group survival, making difficult decisions based on mathematical calculation, while maintaining the human relationships that made survival worthwhile. The 15th day marked 2 weeks since the Yellowstone eruption, and our situation was stabilizing into routines that had become our new normal. The ash was still falling, though less heavily than during the first week. The temperature had stabilized at levels that were manageable with our heating systems, though still far below normal for early August in Colorado. I had established clockwork schedules that governed every aspect of our community life. Meal times were announced by the grandfather clock's chimes. Work assignments were rotated according to precise timing intervals measured by the mantle clocks. Even sleep schedules were coordinated using mechanical timepieces to ensure that someone was always awake to monitor our heating systems and security. The teenage children, Michael and Lisa Miller, had become excellent students of mechanical timekeeping and weather prediction. They could read the barometric pressure gauge accurately and had learned to detect subtle changes in clock behavior that indicated environmental stress. Their youth allowed them to adapt quickly to survival techniques that older adults found challenging. Tom Miller's construction expertise had proved invaluable in maintaining our shelter and creating improvements that increased our security and comfort. He had reinforced the shop's roof to handle the weight of accumulated ash, improved our ventilation systems to reduce indoor air pollution, and created storage solutions that maximized our limited space. Janet Miller's nursing background complemented Dr. Martinez's medical training, creating a healthcare system that could manage most common problems without modern equipment. They had established medical protocols based on mechanical timing, using my clocks to schedule patient monitoring and medication administration with hospital precision. James Chen continued adapting his electronics knowledge to mechanical systems, becoming expert at maintaining and repairing our essential equipment. He had learned clockwork principles quickly and could now service most of the timepieces in my collection, ensuring that our community would have reliable timekeeping even if something happened to me. But the real test of our community came on the 16th day when we faced our first serious conflict over resource allocation. Food supplies were running lower than my calculations had predicted, partly because of the calories needed to heat our bodies in the extreme cold, and partly because we had shared our reserves with the Henderson family during their medical crisis. The conflict began during the morning meal when Michael Miller complained that his food portions were too small for a growing teenager. His father, Tom Miller, supported his son's position and suggested that the food allocation system should account for individual metabolic needs rather than equal distribution among all community members. Dr. Martinez agreed that growing teenagers required more calories than elderly adults, but Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out that any change to our rationing system would create precedents that could destroy community cooperation. James Chen worried that unequal food distribution would lead to resentment and conflicts that could split our group apart. I found myself mediating a dispute that threatened the mathematical precision I had used to maintain order in our community. The clocks could measure time accurately, but they couldn't resolve the complex human questions of fairness and resource distribution that determined whether our group would survive as a unified community or fragment into competing factions. The solution came from an unexpected source when Mrs. Rodriguez suggested that we establish work quotas based on individual capacity rather than equal time commitments. Stronger, younger community members like Tom Miller and his children would take on more physically demanding tasks, while older members like herself would contribute through food preparation, equipment maintenance, and other essential but less strenuous activities. I adapted her suggestion into a systematic approach, using mechanical precision to measure work contributions rather than just time commitments. Each community member would be assigned tasks based on their abilities and would receive food allocations proportional to their contributions. The clocks would measure both time and productivity, creating fair resource distribution based on actual contribution rather than arbitrary equality. The 17th day brought a discovery that changed everything about how I understood our situation and our chances for long-term survival. While checking the shop's basement for structural damage from the ash accumulation, I found a collection of my grandfather's journals that I had forgotten existed, documenting his experiences during the harsh winters of his childhood in Switzerland. The journals, written in his careful German script, described weather conditions during the 1800 and changeover in Europe, when volcanic eruptions and climate changes had created years of abnormal cold and crop failures. My grandfather had been a child during what historians called the year without a summer, and his family had survived using techniques that were directly applicable to our current situation. According to my grandfather's records, his family had survived by abandoning all attempts at normal life and focusing entirely on mechanical systems that could function without external energy sources. They had used clockwork precision to manage every aspect of survival, from fuel consumption to food preservation to work scheduling. Most importantly, they had formed community alliances with other families, sharing resources and knowledge in ways that multiplied everyone's chances for survival. I shared the journal discoveries with our community, translating the German text and explaining how my grandfather's childhood experiences had shaped the survival knowledge he had passed down to me. The techniques he described were exactly what we had been developing independently, suggesting that mechanical precision and community cooperation were fundamental requirements for surviving extended climate disasters. Mrs. Rodriguez was particularly interested in the sections about food preservation and preparation, techniques that could extend our remaining supplies significantly if we implemented them correctly. Tom Miller found detailed instructions for improvised heating systems that could function more efficiently than our current methods. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller discovered medical protocols that could be implemented using mechanical timing and readily available materials. The 18th day forced us to confront the reality that our crisis was not unique in human history, but part of a recurring pattern of climate disasters that had been survived by people with fewer resources than we possessed. My grandfather's journals documented multiple instances when Swiss communities had survived years of abnormal weather by abandoning modern conveniences and returning to mechanical reliability and community cooperation. I began teaching advanced clockwork principles to everyone in our community, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of my family. The mechanical timepieces were not just tools for measuring time. They were examples of how human ingenuity could create systems that functioned reliably regardless of external circumstances. But the journals also contained warnings that filled me with dread about what might be coming. My grandfather had written extensively about the psychological challenges of extended survival, how even strong communities could fragment under the stress of uncertainty and resource scarcity. He had seen families destroy themselves through conflicts that began with minor disagreements, but escalated into violence that killed more people than the actual disaster. The warning proved prophetic when conflicts began emerging within our own community over seemingly minor issues. Tom Miller and James Chen disagreed about heating system priorities. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller had different opinions about medical protocols. Even the teenage children were showing signs of stress that manifested as arguments and behavioral problems. I realized that maintaining community cooperation required more than mechanical precision and fair resource distribution. It required active management of human psychology and group dynamics, skills that my grandfather had learned through bitter experience but had never directly taught me. I was going to have to learn community leadership through trial and error, while the lives of 8 other people depended on my decisions. The cuckoo clock chose that moment to chime 13 times at what should have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon, its impossible announcement echoing through a shop filled with tension and uncertainty. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at me with eyes that reflected decades of survival experience, and I knew she understood that the mechanical warning meant something far worse than weather was approaching our fragile community. The barometric pressure gauge was showing readings so extreme they fell outside its measurement range, suggesting atmospheric disturbances that would make our previous challenges seem minor by comparison. All my weather instruments were indicating that we were about to face conditions that would test every survival technique we had learned and every community bond we had formed. The grandfather clock struck 13 times at what should have been 6 in the evening, an impossibility that filled me with dread. In my family, that sound only meant one thing. The storm to end all storms was coming, and we had perhaps 48 hours to prepare for weather that could destroy everything we had built together. The mechanical timepieces that had been our salvation were now warning us that our greatest test was still ahead. The 19th day began with 13 chimes from the grandfather clock at what should have been dawn, though dawn and dusk had become meaningless concepts in our world of perpetual gray twilight. I stood in my shop surrounded by 8 other people whose lives depended on my ability to interpret the warnings that my mechanical instruments were screaming at us through every gear and spring and pendulum swing. The barometric pressure gauge had broken its needle trying to register readings that fell so far outside normal parameters that the instrument couldn't measure them. I had never seen anything like it in 20 years of clockmaking, and my grandfather's journals contained no references to atmospheric conditions so extreme that they could physically damage mechanical measurement devices. Whatever was approaching us was beyond the scope of recorded meteorological history. Mrs. Rodriguez was propped up against the wall near our improvised heating system, her breathing labored but her eyes alert with the kind of awareness that comes from having survived multiple disasters. She had been watching the cuckoo clock obsessively since its impossible chimes the previous evening, counting each normal announcement while waiting for the next supernatural warning that would tell us how much time we had left to prepare. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller were conducting what they called a medical inventory, but I could see in their faces that they were really calculating how to help people die with dignity when our medical supplies ran out. The harsh mathematics of survival had taught us all to think in terms of worst-case scenarios, and the atmospheric readings suggested we were about to face conditions that would challenge every assumption we had made about what was possible to survive. Tom Miller was reinforcing the shop's windows and doors with materials scavenged from other parts of the building, his construction experience guiding preparations for structural challenges that I couldn't fully comprehend. He had explained that the extreme pressure changes indicated by my barometric instruments could generate wind forces capable of destroying buildings that had stood for decades. We were essentially preparing for a hurricane with the added complications of freezing temperatures and continued ash fall. James Chen was working with our mechanical heating systems, trying to create redundancies that would keep us alive if our primary equipment failed under the extreme conditions that were approaching. His electronics background had taught him to plan for cascading system failures, and he was applying that knowledge to mechanical devices that were already operating at the limits of their design parameters. The teenage children, Michael and Lisa Miller, were helping their parents with preparations while trying to maintain the kind of normal behavior that keeps communities stable during crisis. They had adapted to our survival situation with the resilience of youth, but I could see the stress in their faces as they began to understand that our previous challenges had been practice for something far more dangerous. I gathered everyone around the grandfather clock for what I knew might be our final community, meeting as free people, rather than refugees fighting for basic survival. The mechanical timepieces had taught us to live by precise schedules and systematic resource management, but the approaching storm would test whether our community bonds were strong enough to hold together, when civilization's last pretenses were stripped away by natural forces beyond human control. My grandfather's journals had prepared me for this moment through descriptions of the great alpine storms that had killed entire villages during the climate disasters of the early 1800s. The mechanical warnings were unmistakable to anyone who understood how atmospheric pressure affected precision timekeeping. We were facing a weather system that would make our previous challenges seem like minor inconveniences. The storm announcement came through my weather instruments with mechanical precision that left no room for doubt or hope. The barometric pressure was dropping at rates that indicated wind speeds potentially exceeding 200 miles per hour. The temperature differential between the ash cloud and the surface was creating convection patterns that could generate tornadoes in conditions where tornadoes had never occurred before. But the most terrifying prediction came from the cuckoo clock's continued impossible chimes. The timepiece was now announcing 13 o'clock every 6 hours, a pattern that my grandfather's notes indicated preceded weather events so severe they could alter the landscape permanently. According to family legends passed down through generations of clockmakers, 13 chimes meant nature itself was about to demonstrate forces that human civilization couldn't resist or survive. I explained to our community that we had approximately 36 hours to complete preparations for a storm that would likely last 3 to 4 days and would test every survival technique we had learned over the previous 18 days. The mechanical calculations were brutally simple. We needed enough food, water, and fuel to survive 96 hours without being able to leave the shop or perform any outdoor maintenance on our heating systems. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her deteriorating respiratory condition, insisted on helping with food preparation using preservation techniques from my grandfather's journals. She worked with Janet Miller to create meals that could be eaten cold if our heating systems failed, using ingredients that would provide maximum nutrition and energy for the physical demands of surviving extreme weather conditions. Tom Miller and James Chin collaborated on structural reinforcements that would protect us from wind forces that could turn everyday objects into deadly projectiles. They sealed every opening they could find, reinforced doors and windows with materials from my workshop, and created backup ventilation systems that would prevent carbon monoxide poisoning if our primary air circulation failed. Dr. Martinez established medical protocols for treating injuries and illnesses that might occur during the storm, when normal movement within the shop would be dangerous or impossible. She positioned medical supplies throughout our shelter space so that emergency treatment could be provided regardless of where problems occurred. Most importantly, she briefed everyone on basic first aid techniques that could save lives if she or Janet Miller were injured and unable to provide medical care. The 20th day brought the first signs that our weather predictions were accurate in ways we had hoped would be wrong. The ash fall intensified to levels that made visibility completely impossible beyond the shop's windows. The wind began generating sounds I had never heard before, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from moving air. The mechanical clocks began showing signs of stress that confirmed the extreme nature of the approaching conditions. Even the grandfather clock's massive pendulum was being affected by air pressure changes so severe they were influencing the gravitational forces that governed its movement. The smaller timepieces were running fast or slow, depending on their individual sensitivities to atmospheric disturbances. I spent the morning making final adjustments to every clock in my collection, ensuring that we would have reliable timekeeping even if some of our instruments failed during the storm. The mathematics of survival required precise measurement of time, food consumption, fuel usage, and medical treatments. Without accurate clocks, we would be reduced to guesswork in situations where guesswork could be fatal. Mrs. Rodriguez called me to her side during the afternoon and shared observations that made my blood run cold. She had been listening to the building's structural sounds, applying knowledge gained from surviving the Mexico City earthquake to our current situation. The shop was experiencing stress patterns that indicated the approaching storm would generate forces equivalent to seismic activity, potentially causing structural damage that could make our shelter uninhabitable. The conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez led to an emergency meeting where Tom Miller explained the building's vulnerabilities in detail. The accumulated ash on the roof was already creating more weight than the structure had been designed to support. The extreme wind forces predicted by my barometric readings could create additional stress that might cause partial or complete structural collapse. We faced a decision that could determine whether our community survived the next 4 days. We could remain in the shop and risk being crushed if the building failed, or we could attempt to move to a more secure location during the brief time remaining before the storm reached full intensity. Either choice involved potentially fatal risks that had to be evaluated using mechanical precision rather than emotional reactions. James Chen suggested that we could move to the building's basement, which would provide better protection from wind forces and structural collapse. But the basement also posed risks of flooding if the storm overwhelmed drainage systems, and carbon monoxide poisoning if our ventilation systems failed in the confined space. Dr. Martinez pointed out that moving Mrs. Rodriguez in her current medical condition could be fatal, while leaving her alone during the storm would certainly be fatal. The medical logistics of relocating our entire community with limited transportation options and extreme weather conditions made the basement option extremely dangerous for our most vulnerable member. I found myself making leadership decisions based on mechanical calculations rather than human preferences, using mathematical analysis to evaluate options where every choice involved potentially deadly consequences. The clocks couldn't tell me which decision was correct, but they could measure the time constraints that made quick decision-making essential for community survival. The solution came from Mrs. Rodriguez herself, who insisted that the community's survival was more important than her individual welfare. She proposed that the younger, stronger members of our group move to the basement, while she remained in the main shop with one volunteer to provide medical care and companionship. The plan would maximize survival chances for the majority while accepting calculated risks for a few individuals. Tom Miller immediately volunteered to stay with Mrs. Rodriguez, arguing that his construction experience made him best qualified to monitor the building's structural integrity during the storm. Janet Miller supported her husband's decision, while Dr. Martinez agreed to provide medical supplies and instructions that would allow Tom to provide basic care for Mrs. Rodriguez if her condition deteriorated. I realized that the community leadership burden required me to make decisions that balanced individual relationships against group survival mathematics. Mrs. Rodriguez had become family to all of us, but my grandfather's journals were clear about the harsh calculus of disaster survival. Sometimes saving everyone required accepting that not everyone could be saved under optimal conditions. The 21st day marked the beginning of the storm that would test every survival technique we had learned and every community bond we had formed during our 18 days together. The wind reached sustained speeds that made normal conversation impossible and created structural stress sounds that suggested our building was being tested beyond its design limits. I established the basement shelter using clockwork precision to organize space, supplies, and safety protocols for 7 people in an area designed for storage rather than long-term habitation. The mechanical timepieces that could survive the basement's humidity were positioned to provide accurate timekeeping throughout the storm. Emergency supplies were distributed according to calculated consumption rates for 4 days of intensive survival. Mrs. Rodriguez and Tom Miller remained in the main shop with communication systems that would allow them to contact the basement group if conditions became critical. The separation was emotionally difficult for our community, but mechanically necessary to ensure that some members would survive even if the building suffered catastrophic damage. The storm's fury exceeded every prediction my instruments had made, generating conditions that challenged my understanding of what was meteorologically possible. The wind created pressure differentials that made the building flex and sway like a ship in heavy seas. The sound was beyond description, a continuous roar that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously and made communication possible only through shouting directly into someone's ear. James Chen and I worked together to monitor our heating and ventilation systems, making adjustments that kept our basement shelter habitable while conserving fuel for the extended duration we expected the storm to last. The mechanical systems that had seemed reliable during our previous challenges were now being tested by conditions that pushed every component to its absolute limits. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller managed medical care for stress-related conditions that were affecting everyone in our cramped shelter. The psychological pressure of being trapped underground during the storm was creating anxiety and claustrophobia that required constant attention to prevent panic that could threaten group survival. Michael and Lisa Miller, despite their youth, proved invaluable in maintaining morale and group cohesion during the most difficult hours of the storm. They had adapted to survival conditions with remarkable resilience, and were able to provide emotional stability for adults who were struggling with the extreme stress of our situation. The 22nd day brought the storm's peak intensity and our community's greatest test of unity and determination. Communication with Mrs. Rodriguez and Tom Miller became impossible due to the storm's noise levels, leaving us uncertain about their condition and the building's structural integrity. We were forced to trust in mechanical systems and human relationships that had been built over 18 days of shared survival. The basement shelter's environment became increasingly challenging as humidity from our breathing and heating systems created condensation that threatened our electronic-free, but still vulnerable mechanical timepieces. I spent hours making adjustments that would protect our essential equipment while maintaining the precise timekeeping that governed our food, water, and fuel consumption schedules. James Chen discovered that our ventilation systems were being overwhelmed by the storm's pressure changes, creating air quality problems that could become dangerous if not addressed quickly. We implemented emergency protocols, using techniques from my grandfather's journals about surviving in confined spaces during alpine storms that could last for weeks. Dr. Martinez monitored everyone's physical and psychological condition, using medical protocols adapted for extreme survival situations. The combination of stress, confined space, poor air quality, and uncertainty about our long-term survival was creating health challenges that required constant attention and resource management. The children continued providing emotional support that proved as essential as food and heat for maintaining group morale. Their ability to find hope and humor during our darkest hours reminded all of us why survival was worth the effort and sacrifice that extreme conditions demanded from every community member. The 23rd day marked what I hoped was the storm's final phase, though the continued intensity suggested we might face additional hours of conditions that tested our shelter and supplies beyond calculated limits. The mechanical clocks that had survived the basement environment continued providing accurate timekeeping that allowed us to maintain systematic resource management, even when everything else seemed chaotic and uncertain. I realized that community leadership during extreme crisis required more than mechanical precision and resource calculation. It required maintaining hope and human connections that gave people reasons to continue fighting for survival when rational analysis suggested that surrender might be easier than continued resistance to natural forces beyond human control. Mrs. Rodriguez and Tom Miller had not responded to our attempts at communication for over 12 hours, leaving us uncertain whether they had survived the storm's peak intensity. The uncertainty created psychological stress that threatened group morale and forced me to make decisions about timing our emergence from the basement shelter based on incomplete information about conditions above ground. The storm began showing signs of weakening during what my clocks indicated was late afternoon of the 24th day, though the ash cloud made it impossible to verify time through natural light. The wind speeds were decreasing, and the pressure changes were becoming less severe, suggesting that we might soon be able to assess the damage and determine our next steps for community survival. When we finally dug out of that shop, Denver looked like an alien planet. But the real shock wasn't the frozen wasteland outside. It was discovering that 23 new faces were staring at us from the ash-covered street, all hoping the Clockmaker could save them too. The storm had ended, but our greatest challenges were just beginning as we faced the reality of managing a survival community 3 times larger than anything we had prepared for. The 25th day began with a silence that was almost more disturbing than the storm's fury had been. When we finally emerged from the basement shelter, I found Mrs. Rodriguez and Tom Miller huddled together near the grandfather clock, both alive but clearly changed by their ordeal. Mrs. Rodriguez's breathing was more labored than before, while Tom had developed a persistent cough that suggested ash exposure damage to his respiratory system. But they were the fortunate ones. The 23 new survivors standing in the ash-covered street outside my shop told stories that made our own struggles seem manageable by comparison. They had come from collapsed buildings, failed shelters, and community groups that had disintegrated under the pressure of the mega storm that had just passed. Each face represented dozens of others who hadn't made it through the 4 days of weather that defied every assumption about what was survivable. Maria Santos had walked 15 miles from the suburbs carrying her 4-year-old daughter Alina after their apartment building's roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated ash and storm damage. She was a teacher who had kept 12 children alive in a school basement until the building's heating system failed, forcing them to seek other shelter. Only she and Alina had survived the journey through post-storm conditions that killed the other children through exposure and ash inhalation. Robert Chen, no relation to our James Chen, had been managing a group of 47 seniors at an assisted living facility when the storm destroyed their building's structure and emergency power systems. He had organized the evacuation that saved 21 elderly residents, but the march through frozen Denver streets had reduced that number to 8 survivors by the time they reached downtown. His knowledge of geriatric care and group organization made him invaluable, but his guilt over the lost lives was consuming him. David Park was a Denver firefighter who had been trapped at his station when the storm destroyed the fire department's communications and transportation systems. He had organized rescue operations that saved dozens of people from collapsed buildings, but the experience had taught him that individual heroism was meaningless without systematic community organization. His emergency response training complemented Tom Miller's construction knowledge perfectly. The mathematics of survival suddenly became exponentially more complex. I now had 32 people depending on my mechanical knowledge and leadership abilities, including children, elderly individuals, and people with medical conditions that required resources we simply didn't possess. The food supplies that had been carefully calculated for 9 people would last perhaps 4 days for 32 individuals, and that assumed rationing levels that bordered on starvation. I called a community meeting using the grandfather clock's chimes, establishing protocols that would allow 32 people to participate in decision-making without descending into chaos. The mechanical timepieces provided structure for discussions that covered resource allocation, space management, medical care, and the fundamental question of whether such a large group could survive together or needed to separate into smaller, more manageable communities. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller found themselves overwhelmed by medical needs that exceeded their capabilities and supplies. The new arrivals included diabetics without insulin, heart patients without medication, and children with respiratory conditions that were being exacerbated by continued ash exposure. The harsh mathematics of medical triage meant making decisions about who could be helped and who would have to be made comfortable while they died. Maria Santos proved invaluable in managing the children and establishing educational routines that provided psychological stability during the crisis. Her teaching experience helped create structured activities that kept young minds occupied, while adults made the difficult decisions about resource allocation and long-term survival planning. The children became a source of hope and motivation that reminded everyone why survival was worth the extraordinary effort it required. James Chen and David Park collaborated on expanding our heating and ventilation systems to accommodate 3 times as many people in a space designed for a small clock shop. Their combined technical knowledge allowed them to create solutions that seemed impossible. But their work also revealed how close we were to the absolute limits of what could be achieved with mechanical systems and improvised materials. Robert Chen's experience with elderly care proved essential, as we faced medical challenges involving people whose survival depended on medications and treatments we couldn't provide. His knowledge of geriatric nutrition helped stretch our food supplies by identifying which older community members could survive on reduced caloric intake, and which required additional resources to maintain basic health. Tom Miller's construction expertise became critical, as we assessed structural damage from the storm and implemented repairs that would allow our expanded community to survive in a building that had been stressed beyond its design limits. The roof required constant maintenance to prevent collapse, while the walls needed reinforcement to handle the additional weight and space requirements of 32 residents. The 26th day brought the reality that our survival community had grown beyond the capacity of my shop to house everyone safely. We needed additional space, but expansion required venturing into a Denver that had been transformed into an Arctic wasteland, where familiar landmarks were buried under ash drifts, and structural damage from the mega storm had made entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. David Park led scouting expeditions to nearby buildings, using his firefighter training to assess structural integrity and habitability. His reports revealed that most of downtown Denver had suffered catastrophic damage, with collapsed roofs, broken windows, and heating systems that had failed under conditions they had never been designed to handle. Finding suitable expansion space would require extensive searches in an environment where every expedition risked lives. I established clockwork schedules that managed the complex logistics of housing 32 people in spaces designed for perhaps 10. Sleep rotations, meal times, work assignments, and medical care all required precise timing to prevent conflicts and ensure that everyone's basic needs were met. The mechanical timepieces that had saved our original community now governed a social organization that resembled a small town more than a family. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her deteriorating health, became our cultural coordinator and morale officer for the expanded community. Her stories and traditional knowledge provided emotional stability that helped 32 strangers develop the bonds necessary for cooperative survival. She established cooking rotations that maximized our limited food supplies while creating shared meals that reinforced community identity. The children formed their own support network under Maria Santos's guidance, creating games and activities that provided entertainment while developing skills useful for survival. 8-year-old Elena Santos, 4-year-old Tommy Kim, and the teenage Miller children became examples of resilience that inspired adults who were struggling with the psychological challenges of extended crisis survival. But the expansion also brought interpersonal conflicts that threatened community stability in ways our smaller group had never experienced. Different survival philosophies, resource allocation disputes, and personality clashes created tensions that required constant management to prevent the kind of fragmentation that had destroyed other survivor communities. Leadership skills that had worked for 9 people proved inadequate for managing 32 individuals with diverse backgrounds and expectations. The 27th day forced us to confront the reality that our current location could not sustain such a large community indefinitely. Food supplies were depleting faster than calculated, heating fuel was becoming critically low, and space constraints were creating sanitation and privacy problems that threatened both physical health and psychological well-being. We needed to either reduce our community size or find additional resources and facilities. The discussion about community size led to the most difficult meeting I had ever moderated, with 32 people trying to reach consensus about life and death decisions that would determine who stayed with our established group and who would have to seek survival elsewhere. The mechanical precision that had governed our resource allocation could calculate carrying capacity, but it couldn't resolve the human emotions involved in asking people to leave a community that represented their only hope for survival. Maria Santos proposed that we establish satellite communities in nearby buildings, connected by communication systems and resource-sharing agreements, but small enough to be managed effectively. Her teaching background provided insights into organizational psychology that helped design a structure allowing our expanded group to function as connected smaller communities, rather than one unmanageable large group. David Park supported the satellite community concept and volunteered to lead a group that would establish a second survival center in a building he had identified during his scouting expeditions. His firefighter training made him uniquely qualified to organize a new community, while maintaining connections with our original group for mutual support and resource sharing. Robert Chen offered to coordinate a third satellite community focused on elderly care, using his experience with senior residents to create specialized survival protocols for people whose medical needs required different approaches than younger, healthier community members. His proposal would concentrate limited medical resources while ensuring that older survivors received appropriate care. I realized that our survival success had created challenges that required new forms of leadership and organization. The mechanical precision that had saved 9 people needed to be adapted to coordinate multiple communities with different needs and capabilities, while maintaining the cooperation that made survival possible for everyone involved. The 28th day marked the beginning of our transition from a single survival community to a network of connected groups that could provide mutual support while managing resources more effectively. The satellite community concept required establishing communication systems, resource sharing protocols, and coordination mechanisms that would prevent the isolation and competition that had destroyed other survivor networks. James Chen proved invaluable in creating mechanical communication systems that allowed the satellite communities to coordinate activities without depending on electronic technology that remained unreliable. His improvised signal systems used clockwork precision to schedule contact times and establish emergency communication protocols that could function regardless of weather conditions or equipment failures. I established a rotation schedule that allowed me to visit each satellite community regularly, providing clockwork expertise and coordination while ensuring that mechanical timekeeping and weather prediction capabilities were available to all groups. The grandfather clock remained at our original location, but I distributed other reliable timepieces to ensure that each community could maintain the systematic resource management that was essential for survival. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller created medical protocols that allowed healthcare coordination across multiple locations, sharing limited medical supplies and expertise to provide the best possible care for everyone in our network. Their system prioritized preventive care and early intervention to minimize serious medical emergencies that could overwhelm our limited capabilities. The children adapted to the satellite community structure with remarkable resilience, maintaining friendships and educational activities across multiple locations, while developing independence and survival skills that would serve them well in the long term. Their example helped adults adjust to community arrangements that required more self-reliance while maintaining cooperative relationships. Mrs. Rodriguez, though increasingly confined to bed rest due to her respiratory condition, became our network's oral historian and cultural coordinator. She worked with community members to document survival techniques, record the stories of people we had lost, and maintain the traditions that gave our community's identity and purpose beyond basic survival. The 29th day brought radio contact with other survivor networks across Colorado and neighboring states, providing our first reliable information about conditions beyond our immediate area. The reports confirmed that the Yellowstone eruption had created climate changes affecting the entire continental United States, with similar survival communities forming in cities and rural areas, wherever people had access to resources and leadership. The radio communications revealed that mechanical expertise was becoming one of the most valuable skills in the post-eruption world. Communities with clockmakers, machinists, and people trained in pre-electronic technologies were surviving at much higher rates than groups that depended entirely on modern conveniences. My grandfather's knowledge, passed down through generations of Swiss clockmakers, was proving essential for civilization's survival. We established regular radio contact with survivor networks in Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, and Pueblo, creating information sharing agreements that allowed coordination of resource searches, weather observations, and survival technique development. The mechanical weather instruments that had saved our community were now contributing data that helped other groups prepare for atmospheric conditions throughout the region. David Park's satellite community had successfully established operations in a reinforced building 6 blocks from our original location, demonstrating that the network concept could work with proper planning and coordination. His group of 12 people was managing resources effectively, while contributing specialized skills like emergency response and structural assessment that benefited our entire network. Robert Chen's elderly care community had found a medical facility with better heating and ventilation systems, allowing specialized care for older survivors while freeing up space and resources in our other locations. His success proved that targeted approaches to different population needs could improve survival outcomes for everyone involved. The 30th day marked exactly 1 month since the Yellowstone eruption had transformed our world from a technological civilization to a mechanical survival society. Our original community of 9 people had grown into a network of 32 survivors organized in 4 connected communities that were successfully managing resources and maintaining cooperation, despite challenges that had destroyed many other groups. I spent the day visiting each community location, checking mechanical timepieces, taking weather readings, and coordinating resource distribution using the systematic approaches that had evolved over our month of survival. The clockwork precision that had saved our original group was now governing a social organization that resembled the pre-industrial communities my grandfather had described in his journals from 19th century Switzerland. Mrs. Rodriguez, though weakened by her respiratory condition, insisted on participating in our 1-month anniversary gathering. Her presence reminded us of how much we had all changed during 30 days that had transformed strangers into family members who would risk their lives for each other's survival. Her stories about community survival during previous disasters provided perspective on our achievements and challenges. The children had adapted completely to survival life, developing skills and resilience that would serve them well in a world where electronic convenience had been replaced by mechanical reliability and community cooperation. Their example provided hope that human civilization could continue evolving and adapting to environmental challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. Tom Miller had become our network's construction coordinator, managing building maintenance and infrastructure improvements across all 4 communities. His expertise ensured that our shelters could continue protecting us through whatever weather conditions the altered climate might produce in the months and years ahead. James Chen had evolved into our chief technology officer, maintaining mechanical systems and developing new solutions to survival challenges that arose as our communities grew and adapted to long-term survival rather than short-term emergency response. His combination of electronic knowledge and mechanical skills made him invaluable for managing the complex systems that kept 32 people alive. Dr. Martinez and Janet Miller had created a healthcare network that provided medical care equivalent to a small hospital, using mechanical timing and systematic protocols to manage everything from routine wellness checks to emergency surgery using improvised equipment and limited pharmaceutical supplies. The astronomical clock that had belonged to my great-grandfather was showing calculations indicating that the ash cloud and climate disruption could persist for years rather than months. The mechanical predictions suggested we were facing a new ice age that would require permanent changes to how human civilization organized itself around survival priorities rather than technological convenience. But as I looked around our anniversary gathering, seeing 32 people who had learned to depend on mechanical precision and community cooperation for their daily survival, I realized we had already begun adapting to that new world. The steady ticking of clockwork timepieces had become the heartbeat of communities that proved human resilience could overcome even the most catastrophic environmental changes. People ask me how I knew we'd survive those first 30 days. Truth is, I didn't. But I had something everyone else had forgotten: the ability to measure time without electricity, to predict weather without satellites, to fix things with my hands instead of calling tech support. My grandfather's clocks are still ticking, and as long as they keep time, we keep going. In this new frozen world, that steady mechanical heartbeat is the sound of hope itself. The clocks keep ticking, measuring moments in a crisis that taught us the difference between surviving and living. We learned that civilization isn't about the technology we build, but about the communities we create and the knowledge we pass down through generations. As long as these mechanical timepieces continue their steady measurement of time, humanity will continue adapting and surviving, one precisely measured second at a time.